My workshop is going to be on a particular treatise that dates back to the 16th century in Germany, and that's a longsword treatise. So many of you, I guess, are familiar with the Lichtenauerian tradition, the tradition from Johannes Lichtenauer. We know that there are many glossators of this tradition with different additions and betterments added to a poem that probably dates back to the 14th century. Hans Medel is part of the Lichtenauerian tradition. And some of you may ask, so why does the treatise from the Lichtenauerian tradition is studied or presented specifically in an event where we are interested in hipster sources, in sources which go a little bit outside of a usual treaded path of what we can see in what I would say is mainstream HEMA, although we know that HEMA is not mainstream at all. So Medel, the manuscript of Medel was part of Paulus Hector Mayer's collection of treatises. Paulus Hector Mayer, for those who don't know, was a 16th century treasurer of Augsburg and probably the patron of Hymnists. So the most notorious person at the time who collected ancient texts and was himself a fencer and partaked into fencing events. And among his collection, that was later sold to the Oettingen-Wallerstein library, and that is now available in German public libraries. Among his collection, there is this specific treatise that was annotated by Paulus Hector Mayer himself, and that was written probably by a student of Hans Medel, or at least someone who was familiar with his writings. It's not Hans Medel himself who wrote the treatise, probably not, because sometimes Hans Medel is referred to at the third person. But what is particularly striking about this treatise is that although it is part of the Lichtenauerian tradition, although it cites of a poem of Lichtenauer, the Zettel, although you can find a lot of references to other glosses in it, notably the glosses of Sigmund Schilling am Ringek, as well as the lost gloss of Hans Seidenfaden. Hans Medel does his own thing. He takes the vocabulary from Lichtenauer, he takes concepts from the Zettel, he takes a lot of words and techniques that you know from elsewhere, and he presents really his own system. So there are two parts in the manuscript itself, but currently the manuscript is a collation of several manuscripts. There is the first part, which is dedicated to the rules of fencing of a city of Augsburg, and then there is what we call the Hans Medel Fechtbuch. And there is a third part, which is only illustrations from later artists, Martin van, I don't speak Dutch, so I will not pronounce his name, but it's a 17th century artist with depictions of Fechtschule and wrestling techniques, which could be a treatise in itself, but there is no text at all. And the Hans Medel Fechtbuch itself is separated in two parts. The first part is basically a gloss of the gloss of Ringek. And the second part is pretty much Hans Medel teachings condensed into what he calls the 7 stances, the 7 positions, and the different techniques that come from them. So that's pretty much what I can say about Medel without rambling for too long. But don't hesitate if you have any question. I don't want to spoil too much of it, but be prepared to question what you think you know about the Lichtenauerian tradition, and be prepared to question the meaning that you put into the technical words that are part of the global German vocabulary for fencing. Any questions? I can spoil a little bit.
But, what do we know about Hans Medel?
What do we know about Hans Medel? Very little, actually. I've heard Christian Trocler, who's done the English translation for the Hans Medel Fechtbohr, give a conference where he presented some material where he was saying that Hans Medel, at the time of the 30 years, I think, after the presumed date of the writing of the treatise, was a Schermeister in the city of Augsburg, and he was part of a mercenary troop. But I haven't looked at the primary material for that, so I just rely on secondary literature for this. And other than that, well, we know that he is also the only author to cite Hans Seidenfaden, who is part of the Gesellschaftliche Nauers in the Paulus-Karl. And we don't have the text from Seidenfaden, but it's cited and commented upon into the Hans Medel Fechtbohr.
Okay.
And he was from Salzburg, yes, that we know. So he was Austrian, was part of the Roman German Empire.
Any other question? So that will be a long sword. It
is, yes. It's exclusively a longsword treatise, okay. And without armor. Mostly from what it's also the only illustrated treatise that we have for this event. So there are illustrations into the Hans Medel Fechtbohr. Some of those illustrations were copied into Paulus-Hector Mayer's own treatise, or at least some of those are very, very similar to the point that it's probably an artist copy. But from the depictions, we have swords that are rounded. We have the typical shield from what we call today Federschwert or Paradschwert. And we have the typical costumes worn by 16th century burghers participating into Fechtschulen, which were the fencing events, the public fencing schools, which were not as much schools at events, and I don't want to use the word competition, but I struggle to have a better term in English, which were popular in 16th century German places. So mostly, it's probably adapted for Fechtschulen fencing.
Questions? More questions? Anything that you're all waiting for tomorrow morning?
Yeah, because there is all the whole part of what he do that if we ask now, it's like too much.
Well, the most known thing about Medel is that he mixes up the names of the guards. Which is the first frustration that you're going to have if you start reading the treatise and start to understand and try to understand the different techniques and the different pieces into the work. And that's a well-known fact, so that's not really a spoiler. But basically, from the four canonical Lichtenauer guards, so Vom Tag, Ochs, Pflug, and Alba, three of those are mixed up. So he has Vom Tag, this is Alba, this is Ochs, and this is this is Pflug, yes. So that's practical to read, but that's not the only word and the only pieces of technical vocabulary that he likes to adapt to his own views. And the worst part is that's not a mistake. He knows exactly what he does. He knows that different glosses are using the same words differently. Which is something that you can find in other Lichtenarian sources as well. Most famous example of that is the 3227a, the Pseudo-Dobringer Fechtbohr, which is in the same way mixing two of the guards, Pflug and Albe. And some modern interpretation of that estimate that this is a mistake, and some estimate that this is an actual distinct use of the words. So studying sources like unconventional, unorthodox sources like Medal can shed a new light on that kind of considerations.
And why did he do that? Do you think it's like he wants people to think back at what they know about fencing, or it's more like he thinks a Pflug is more realistic from lower, and it's more like a visualization, or more like, okay, we need to think back the way we fight?
My opinion is he does his own thing, and our understanding of what is a tradition of fencing, a tradition of martial arts, should not be rooted too much into having very fixed way of thinking and way of naming and way of representing what a strike is. And pretty much that's something that you can see into living martial arts traditions, where a student is going to learn techniques and names and things from his masters, and then he's going to become a master himself, and he's going to teach, and he's going to teach something that is not exactly the reflection from what he learned, but he's going to add his own views, he's going to add his own teachings, he's going to prefer some aspects of fencing because probably maybe the context has changed, maybe fashion has changed, maybe the way of fencing has changed, but maybe also just the individuality of the master is expressing itself through his teachings.
One question.
Actually, I wonder how you can say today that that you know, or people know that he meant in one way or another. How can you be sure that he was not mistaken? I mean, does he say at some point or write somewhere? People call it this way, but I prefer going.
That's exactly how we know.
He actually.
That's exactly how we know that because in his treatise himself, he's going to say, okay, so this is
what you think
such technique. Other people are saying, and he's going to copy the gloss from Rengek. And so that's really how we can say for sure that he knew what he was doing, at least for part of the techniques that we are going to develop. Not knowing what he was doing as a fencer, but knowing what he was doing in changing the vocabulary, changing the names of techniques, and saying, okay, I call this way. One of the examples that we can give is the crown, the Kroonhoed, which is this is something that we know appears differently in different treatises. For some treatises, the crown, the guard of the crown is just simply, and that's usually the interpretation that is known, is that it's simply you hold a sword in front of you with the equivalence of a sword protecting your head. But in some other German treatises, the crown is you hold the sword by the middle of the blade on top of your head. And we know that from other sources as Medal, and Medal presents both. And he says, he presents the guard like this position, and he's going to cite Hans Seidenfaden and say, well, he does it this way, but the name of the guard is the same.
the Medal of Treaty in the library?
No, it's not. I brought my own copy because I have published last year a French translation of Hans Medal that I've done conjointly with Hélène Leblanc, who is going to be there tomorrow as well. So we've published that last year. I have my own copy, and we'll have a very few copies of the treaties themselves to sell, if that's okay. Otherwise, I can just write your email and your address and send them later. But yeah. So if you want to take a look at the treaties, both the transcription and French translation, I have a copy there.